Hello and welcome to an intro to our Supporting Neurodiverse Students statewide professional learning system virtual learning opportunities. So first I want to tell you that within either a live virtual training or if you're watching one of our modules or our virtual recordings, I want you to make sure that you kind of keep some of these norms in your head. That if you have questions, ask someone. Collaboration is one of the best ways we learn. And if you don't have anybody directly connected to this work or that you can really brainstorm with, email me. I'm here. My email will be at the end of this video and is at the end of every training. Make sure you reach out to somebody within your space, within your educational realm, or if you need to reach out to me, I'm here for you. So don't live in the wonder. Start exploring the wonder. When we listen and think about the things that we might hear in some of these trainings, it might push back on some of our previous thoughts or belief systems. And know that our brain really doesn't want to change. So if you feel yourself going, Katie, I'm not really sure that's this kid, or I don't know if I'm really on board with you on that, dive into that. Dive into why you are thinking that this uncomfortable thought, that no, that might not be it. It might be your brain just fighting it. And really, if you dive into it and you learn more about it, it might fit your belief system more than you think. So I want you to make sure that when you listen fully, we're really looking at how do I not let my brain avoid and stop me from learning new things. And that means also thinking about what you've learned and finding a place for it to live and integrating it into your thought process, right? We enhance our learning. New learning is always an enhancement. We layer on top of things. Rarely do we put something in new and have it be like not connected to anything. It's really not going to stick unless it connects to something. So when we listen to strategies or different ways of thinking, we've got to make sure we are thinking about how does it live in what I already know and how do I adjust what I already know so that I'm doing better. I know better. I do better, right? We move forward in that way. And when we stay curious and we really think about where am I coming from, where are my bias coming from, and how do I interrupt those to be able to move forward, that's where true learning really takes place. That collaboration and exploring and reflecting and being able to say, hey, this is where I'm at and this is where I'm going, and being able to move forward together with people and also alone. I also want you to make sure, since either you're watching these on your own, that you take breaks in any kind of live situation, whether in person or in a virtual setting where you live. We purposely put in breaks. So I encourage you to make sure that if you're doing this on your own, they are taking breaks. At least look away at your screen every once in a while. It's tough to sit for an hour and a half. We do try to keep things short, but there's a lot of content. So make sure you're taking your breaks and allowing your brain to come back to work in the way that you want it to work. We embed ourselves and come from the idea of best practices. And so a lot of the language we're going to use is going to be like the pie in the sky, like, oh my gosh, if everything was in place, all of this would work out wonderfully. And so I want you to make sure that you know that we're doing this out of base of high leverage practices and evidence-based improvement strategies. And so when we learn something new and we find things out that are going to push us forward, it's better to be coming from research-based, and more research is better. The CEC's high leverage practices for special education are a great way to start. They're really a basis of how we show up as educators. And so when we look at how do we put our methods into place. It might not be lesson 26, but how do I show up in my morning meeting situation? Or how do I show up in the interactions I have with kids? The Council for Exceptional Children, the CEC, high leverage practices are a great place to start to either remind yourself of practices you're good at and get them really back into the swing of things, or to learn a new one. When we look at actual particular strategies and evidence-informed improvement strategies, we're looking at whether or not is it research-based and what level of research, but also is it and does it match the kid? If it doesn't match kid, then it can have all the research in the world and it's really going to go nowhere for that child in front of you. So we got to think about a couple layers within how we show up as educators and as moving forward to be able to meet the child where they're at and help develop the skills that we're working on within special education or within your educational realm, whichever approach or area you're within. The other piece I want to talk about is that we really do have this really nice definition of equity within our state, and it's a really big push and way of thinking, not a lens. I don't want to take it off. I want to be in this inclusive and equitable type of thought process. And our kids who get special education services are some of the most marginalized children in the state. And we've got lots of different layers of how children get marginalized. And when you get a special education label and get put into services, we do start marginalizing in a lot of different ways. And so we have to look at that within our educational system of how do we interrupt that. We also very much live in a UDL process. And if you aren't familiar with Universal Design for Learning, it is the idea that you have a goal. And in an IEP system, we have IEP goals, but we have lots of other goals outside that. So we have this goal, this idea in mind of what we want to do. We think through and say, hey, what are the barriers we're going to hit? Because they're just barriers. They're not things that are going to stop me. They're just going to be things that I need to work through. Okay, or my group of co-planners need to work through. Then I'm going to say, hey, I found these barriers and these are the possible ways to break them down. I am now going to make them part of my system, right? Not just an easy lift of here, you can choose what kind of pencil you want to use, but how do I change my system to break down barriers of access, engagement, and progress? And when we do that, then we can get back to see if we break down those barriers and make them part of our system and how we show up, is it meeting our goal? And when we look at that, we are truly doing that UDL process. And the more and more we make things that were barriers and the strategies to break down those barriers part of our system, whether it's within our own educational mode or whether it is within our system, within our schools, the better we're showing up for all students, not just the student in front of us. When we think about the area in which we're going to talk about with any of the other trainings you see in the SNS, we are a social and emotional area type of information giver. Okay, so academics, right? And social emotional, they go together. We're going to talk about those social emotional piece, but we're going to take the deep dive into them. So if you're not familiar with our state's social emotional competencies, that's the human level. That's the everyone. That's the here's the progression that is expected, and it's got grade ranges, and it's a great resource to give us language to talk about some of this stuff so that we're talking together in a cohesive way, and thinking about some of these things, like social awareness and responsible decision making and self-management, right? And self-awareness and relationship skills, which are all these pieces that make us be able to show up to be able to learn academics in school. And so when we think about what the Supporting Neurodiverse Students Professional Learning System brings us, it's the deep dive into those buckets, okay? So when we take a deep dive into those buckets, we've got prerequisite skills to be able to show up with some self-awareness. We've got some prerequisite skills to be able to show up with social awareness. And when we break those down and really help find that need, that in special education, disability-related need, we have a skill to work on to be able to support and move a child forward to become the best them they can be. So when we think about what is the subject area in which we're going to be talking about, it is social emotional learning, but it is the deep dive into it. And we also follow a process of making sure that all our trainings have the social emotional learning signature practices, which is basically relationship builder in the beginning, an inclusion activity, engage while we are learning, get that brain really going, which we're super into because we're all about brain with the SNS, and then leave on a happy note, an optimistic closer, especially if we're thinking about doing this within a meeting. We need to leave on a happy note because if we don't, we're just setting our brain to go into a negative cycle. So let's think about, how do I close with my students, with my meeting, with whatever situation you're in, on a happy note, in a good thought process and an optimistic thought process versus maybe a negative, woe is me, where are we kind of situation. When we think about what the SNS and the learning opportunities you have within the virtual and in-person pieces that we have, we really look at how the brain works as a whole. Okay, so you can't pull academics and social emotional out of your brain separately. We very much pay attention to them in the IEP, within the academics box and the functional box, right? They get a little bit separated there, but within our brain, they're not really separate, right? Our brain is this really complicated, integrated thing that codes and prunes and does a whole bunch of really amazing things as a whole. Okay, there isn't like this bucket here, like here's where you learn diphthongs and here's where you learn relationship skills. It's all very, very interconnected. And even though we used to think of it as a filing cabinet, let's start thinking about it as this network, because when we think about all the different ways things can go in and things can go back out, we can then start to discover some of the interrupted systems or the connections that aren't as strong for some of our students. And that's why we're seeing maybe behavior that's challenging to us or confusing to us. And that all goes within a processing system and an executive functioning system of things like impulse control and management and all these pieces that your brain is just trying to function as a brain. So there's lots of different levels that we have within how our brain works. And we do dive into that in a lot of different ways within a lot of our trainings. But I want you to know that it's a very integrated process. It's not, I don't file and retrieve. I have all these different connections, and lots of different connections can retrieve out a lot of different ways. And experiences are very personal. And that's what builds our brain. Our brain is basically the same until we start experiencing things. And we start experiencing things in the womb. So immediately, things are different for every person, but every person's brain is going to predict and move forward on their experiences. And perception is extremely real, no matter how different or divergent it is from the general consensus perception. So when we think about that, our brain can be really cool and really helpful, but it also can put up some barriers that we want to make sure that we're aware of so we can support children in moving forward. And when we keep diving in, right, we're talking about social emotional learning. Now, the supporting neurodiverse students professional learning system is really going to dive deeper into kids who have brain differences, divergent brain differences. And there's lots and lots of medical and educational labels that show up that might fall into what we call neurodiverse. And so here you see a couple: autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, kids who have experienced adversity in life, or we might call having trauma within their life, developmental delays, mental illness, anxiety, sensory processing disorder, emotional behavioral disorder, right? There's lots and lots, neurologically glitchy, right? Lots and lots of different ways that within the social emotional learning range, you might have really divergent skills, right? Those prerequisite skills are the ones we're working on. That's what we're here to talk about. That's our main cup of tea, right? Our main bucket. We really want to help people, because when we think about how we got into education and whatever path we took, or we're a family member or a parent, or we are a community member, these type of subjects really aren't things that come up in common talk or common classes if you went through college or an educational system to learn about things. And so that's what we're here to fill. We're here to fill that gap of understanding, because there's no way to know everything about every single person on the planet, but you have to have resources you can reach out to learn what is it all about? What's this child maybe possibly experiencing, and how can I support them? And so we're here to help that super divergent neurological difference, not body difference, but brain difference, that would cause most likely behavior that is challenging to us or very confusing to us, and is really socially maybe mismatching situations and causing social fails for a student. So we're going to get past these labels, and we're going to dive deep, deep, deep. Now, we are an educational grant, and therefore we are going to speak and go through the lens of education. Although family, parents, community members can learn a lot from this information too, because we are a team. It is a collective responsibility when we show up for people. And so when we think about how we're going to label it within these trainings, you're going to hear me say disability-related need a lot. That is language we use within education to really get to what's the skill. Right? We see the effect. We see the behavior that's challenging to adults, or we see the social, the divergent social path that a person has taken that may not match the rest of the perception around them, and therefore feels and may be a social fail in their mind. Okay, we're going to call that disability-related need, the skill that we're moving forward with, that need that we're going to work on, especially within the special education IEP services realm. Because when we think about what we're talking about, and you think about students, and we think about the college and career ready IEPs that we have, and the process that we follow to be able to show up for kid, it is a really good belief system and strategy to be able to make sure we're looking at whole child, right? A student can have this need, but that need lives within a whole child. And so when we understand where they're showing up, right, understanding where they're at and how to meet them there, really diving in and asking yourselves, what is going on here? I see what's happening. It looks like, sounds like this, but what's that really mean? What's the underlying cause that's going on here? And then I'm going to say, okay, here's where we're going to go. This is where I know where they are. This is my suspected idea of what skill set is the barrier here. Now I'm going to develop some goals to be able to help support the growth in that barrier. I'm going to put in my services to make sure that we've got whole child, whether it's a multi-level system support service or whether it is a special education needs service, right? There's different layers to how we show up. We're going to make sure we align all those things and then keep track of how we're doing and how we're moving forward. And not just, did I decrease, how many times did you run from the room, but what skill set is growing? And it's not just when the IEP comes up once a year or twice a year. I'm going to be constantly progress monitoring. I'm going to be looking at progress monitoring social emotional learning, not just academic learning throughout the year, not just when an IEP comes up. So when we do this cycle and we do really well with it, we really are making that individual education plan and the true meaning of why it was created. But we can't do that alone. We often, especially in special education, silo ourselves. We think everybody else silos us. Nope, we silo ourselves as really as well. So I want to really emphasize the fact that if you're not moving forward, whether it's developing the idea or brainstorming whether or not what skill is the barrier here, or if it is picking a strategy that matches child, or if it's whatever it is, that we are co-planning. And if you have a student that can co-plan with you at any level, I highly encourage you are doing that with them. You can start that at 3. You do not have to wait till 14 when the child is legally required to say, yes, I want to attend an IEP meeting, which is just one layer of involvement, right? We can be co-planning with kid from the beginning. And that looks very different at every age and at every language base and at every social emotional understanding base, like your regulatory state or your social understanding base. But we really need to be thinking about how do we co-plan with kid. And if we do not have a student who has a language system that is strong enough yet to be able to communicate in a way that gives us a ton of really good information, then one, we're working on that, but then we look to family. We're going to look to family anyway. But then we might have to rely on family for those who are showing up with a communication system that's not strong enough for everybody to understand yet. Okay. But family, we're putting into place no matter what. And it's not just asking, when do you want your IEP meeting? When we really engage, not just involve, but engage with families, the power to help support those kids in front of us astronomically grows, right? And not every family is accessible and can access school back, right? So we've got variance with that as well, but it's how are we trying to show up in engagement versus just we tell you or you show up to us. Lots of layers that and lots of different ways we can access that with an information around that within some of the resources we have within our state. And then we have our colleagues. And sometimes we need to not limit ourselves to colleagues that fit the IEP team member piece. The school secretary sometimes knows our kids really, really well, or the engineer, or the person serving lunch. We've got lots of different people in our buildings that build huge relationships with our kids. And when we think about social emotional learning, who do we really need to leverage in growing, especially in regulatory state or in social states? Anybody that child has a good relationship with. And so don't limit yourself to colleagues, meaning your IEP team members. And look to expertise. Just because somebody didn't go to school for some particular thing doesn't mean that they're not so invested in it, haven't done so much research on their own that they aren't a very good resource and or expert in an area. So make sure that we're really looking at not doing things on our own, but always co-planning and thinking about what layer of co-planning that we can engage in. Because our goal is to get our students as self-determined as possible. Lots of different ways to get there so that they're their own causal agent, not totally influenced by everybody around them, making choices for them all the time, but being able to make those decisions, make those goals, have this drive to say, hey, this is where I want to go. This is who I want to be, right? We're here to help them be the best them they can be, not fix them. Not tell them what they should be doing, but to have them be able to know and say, this is what I want. And past the question of for the PDP, what do you want to do when you grow up, right? And how, like the layered pieces that you do for a PDP. But really, what's your path? What do you enjoy? What is it that makes you thrive? And then helping and supporting them be able to meet all those things and all those paths that they have in their mind, right? And we can do that in lots of different ways to be able to take action on helping a person become self-determined. We can make them as highly involved in their IEP as possible. I love when we can actually get to a high schooler who is actually creating their IEP. That is like the best practice. Awesome. I wish we could get there for so many more students than we do. But sometimes we just need to start getting them involved. And that's a good place to start. Teaching people about how their brains work. Dan Siegel says, when you name it, you can tame it. So let's look at, hey man, my brain works like this way. All right. Then I'm going to I can take action because I know there's something I can take action on now. You need to have the knowledge to be able to do that. And so teaching kids how their brain's working, not in a way that it's broken, but hey, it just works different. Difference, not less. And then that self-goal setting. To be self-determined, you've got to be able to say, this is what I want to do. This is where I want to go. This is how I want to go move forward. And so when we take those kind of three things, and there's lots of other things, relationship building, lots of other layers of self-determination. But in my mind, those are some of the really strong ones that we can take actual items on and show up for kids. We really are making a path of helping those kids not need us when they leave us. Okay, because there's no self-contained McDonald's. And so when we make them so codependent on us in the school, some kids will describe when they leave us at 18 to 21 as falling off a cliff because you had all this support. And some of it was legally required. Some of it was just really good relationship building. And then at 18 to 21, they leave us, whoop, it's gone. And either you have your family to rely on or maybe a job situation that you're moving into or a friend situation you're moving into. But that's not guaranteed. And so you have this huge support system. And now you might have a very limited support system or no support system. So we really have to be looking at how do we make it so they can survive without us as much as we can? What's the independence level for this student? What's the next level of independence? Everybody has a next level of independence. It might look very different from one student to another, but everybody has that next step. And how are we always keeping in that head? How do I work myself out of a job? The best teacher is a teacher that's not needed anymore, right? So when we think about that, how do I make it so that they are not falling off a cliff when they leave us, and that we've given them as much independence and self-determination skills so they can take that path that they want to be on and be the best them they can be. The last thing I want to mention is that I really hope that at the end of any of these trainings that you do, whatever access point you go into this website with or our in-person trainings, is that you take a moment to appreciate what you do well. Because there is something you heard or something you came across in one of these trainings that you already do and probably do really well. And I want you to appreciate that. And I want you to say, man, I got that. Cool. That confirms what I'm doing is right. And I like it. Right now, I also want you to take some time to reflect. We skip this so often and it is so important. Take time to think about what's the one thing I want to move forward on. What's my action item? Pick one thing to enhance, take out, or put into your practice as a result of what you learned in the training that you engaged in. If we're not taking action, then we just listen to some fun information and it goes nowhere for kid. So take that information, do something with it, collaborate with other people, get help and spread the information. But find an action item. And if it's within your own practice or within your system or within your collaboration with others, pick a path. Because if we're not moving forward, then we just spent a lot of time listening to something fun and maybe really interesting to you, but it doesn't do anything for kid. Okay, we've got to change our brain and we got to move forward if we want to have impact. Thank you.